For many, this was the end. For many more, it was the beginning. But for all of us, everything changed here in Normandy on these sands. The day they all embarked to come here, they received a letter from their Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was June 5th, 1944.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Liberty Ship is the name that President Roosevelt gave to the nearly 3,000 cargo ships built in the United States from 1941 until 1945. To ensure the supplying of the Allied forces, the pace of production rose to 1 per day. Braving all the dangers of the North Atlantic, these ships transported the means to bring Europe its liberty.
There have always been wars in one place or another on our planet, but during the 20th century, war extended to the entire world twice in the space of 20 years. Having started in Europe, it is here too that the Second World War began to come to an end. In France, and to be precise, in Normandy. It was here in Normandy that a new balance for the world as we know it today was forged. But during the war, Normandy was not as welcoming as it is today. Because from 1940, France, like most of Europe, was occupied by German troops of the Third Reich, led by Adolf Hitler, with Italy as its ally, forming the Axis. Only the United Kingdom remained free after its victory in the Battle of Britain. In June, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and triggered a massive offensive against the Soviet Union, opening up an enormous battlefront in the east of Europe. In December, after Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war along with the British and the Russians against the Axis forces. Despite Japan's infamy, Franklin Roosevelt agreed with Winston Churchill to liberate Europe first. Hitler knew this. To concentrate his best troops on the Eastern Front, he had to protect his western flank from a seaborne attack. In March, he ordered the building of a defensive system along 4,000 kilometers of coastline, the Atlantic Wall. By that August, construction had only got as far as the foundations when the Canadian troops attempted a first landing operation at Dieppe.
August 18th, 19th, and 20th, 1942. Dear Mom and Dad, there's enough moonlight for me to continue my letter aboard our assault barge. If I should be among the casualties, Jacques will let you know what happened to me, as we've promised to do this for one another, in case one of us does not return. I love you from the bottom of my heart. Robert.
The landing was a disaster. Of the 6,000 soldiers present, more than half were wounded, killed, or taken prisoner. This led Hitler to believe his own propaganda, describing the Atlantic Wall as an impenetrable barrier. The artillery batteries were the strongest elements of the Atlantic Wall. Hidden back from the shoreline, each bunker housed a cannon that could destroy a ship 20 kilometers away. The exact position of the ships was given by the command post overlooking the sea. Each battery was a small fortress capable of devastating a fleet.
Glauben Sie mir, meine Herren, das wird für die Alliierten, aber auch für die Deutschen der längste Tag werden.
After inspecting the Normandy beaches, General Rommel oversaw their reinforcement. He covered them with millions of mines and all kinds of obstacles. Many were immersed at high tide to destroy landing craft and stop a naval attack at the beaches. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had 58 divisions under his command on the Western Front. 39 of these, averaging 14,000 men each, were placed under Rommel's orders. Well protected behind the wall, an army of engineers developed new weapons that could tip the war in favor of the Axis. V-1s, the first cruise missiles, and V-2s, the first rocket missiles, could be aimed at England. And once operational, the first jet aircraft would be able to surpass the fastest Allied fighters. The Russians pushed the Germans back to their borders. The Allies retook North Africa and surged into southern Italy. The opening of a second front in Western Europe would allow them to take the Third Reich in a pincer attack. But first, they needed to breach the Atlantic Wall. That was the aim of Operation Overlord, commanded by an American general, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Two-and-a-half-ton truck, A real all-rounder, the six-wheel drive truck was involved everywhere for all uses during the Second World War. Of the 800,000 trucks made in 4 years, more than 100,000 went to the Soviet Army.
Since entering the war, the United States had developed its military effort with an enormous industrial capacity. The Allies had won the Battle of the Atlantic, and now even England's numerous ports were not enough to accommodate all of the arriving ships. For the military forces of 12 different nations, the whole of England became a gigantic training camp. While the largest military gathering in history prepared to invade Europe, the Allied commanders kept the date and the place of the landings a secret until the eve of D-Day. The location had to combine different imperatives: be near a large deep-water port and within the operational radius of fighter planes taking off from England. It had to have flat, wide, and deep beaches to enable thousands of men and their equipment to land and quickly move inland. The countryside had to be suitable for the construction of makeshift airfields. In the end, 2 French locations fit all the criteria best: the Calais area and western Normandy. By deciphering the codes generated by the Reich's coding machine Enigma, the Allies knew that Hitler's generals were expecting a landing around Calais. This big port was on the quickest route to Germany. Thus, it was the most heavily protected section of the Atlantic Wall. So the Allied planners chose Normandy. Although further from England, it was also more lightly defended. And if the bridges over the Loire and the Seine were destroyed, it would be difficult for German reinforcements to access. To increase the element of surprise, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception plan to encourage the Germans to concentrate their troops away from Normandy. Double agents reported information on the 1st U.S. Army Group amassing just across from Calais, commanded by the legendary General Patton. But these armies were fake. In addition, clouds of metallic strips were dropped to deceive radars spread along the coast and create the illusion of a large-scale attack. At dawn, on D-Day, big clouds of this chaff were dropped around Calais. At the same time, the Allies did everything possible to get intelligence on Normandy. They collected millions of postcards and family photographs of the coastline from before the war. They took aerial photographs and sent in commandos to collect sand samples from the beaches. But it was the French resistance that supplied invaluable, detailed information on the German troop and defense positions. Exiled in London, General de Gaulle appealed to French men and women at home to rise up against the German occupation and form the resistance, a real shadow army. Risking their lives, they carried out orders sent from London. Every evening, in the greatest of secrecy, they listened to a special British radio program. These ordinary French phrases were actually coded messages. And this verse from a French poem formed the first part of the signal that Violette and her companions had been expecting for 4 years. The landing would take place in 5 days' time. Never had an invasion been as well prepared as that of Normandy. General Montgomery, who had beaten Rommel in North Africa, designed the final plan. More than 130,000 men would land on 5 codenamed beaches: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. These beaches stretched 80 kilometers along the coast. For the Americans, objective number 1 was Cherbourg. Impossible to capture from the sea, they needed to seize this important port from the land. For the British and Canadians, objective number 1 was Caen, to ensure an anchor for the Allies on the continent and open the route to Paris. The resistance had to carry out sabotage operations to isolate Normandy and disturb communications between the German command posts. The date of the assault would also be determined by a combination of favorable conditions. Right before the landing on the beaches, paratroopers would need the darkness of night to secure the flanks of the assault zone. But the bombers would need a full moon to find their targets. So that night, the full moon had to rise, but late. The morning of the landings, a high tide would hide the obstacles, but a low tide would extend the distance to cross. So the tide had to have started rising. In June 1944, the right conditions for both tide and moon would only happen to Normandy between the 5th and the 7th. A never-ending wait in the rain began.
June 5th, 1944. My darling Barbara. There aren't many men able to sleep tonight. Most of us are sitting around talking, generally doing what men do when they're anxious. A little afraid, not wanting to show it.
Okay, we'll go. With these words at dawn on June 5th, after a final weather report promising marginal conditions, Eisenhower launched the largest and most important military operation ever. His letter was read by tens of thousands of men embarking on the European assault, and he went in person to encourage some of them. In France that day, the German Weather Bureau had not forecast a break in the Channel storms. Reassured, Rommel left France for Germany. The next day, June 6th, was his wife's birthday.
Alles Gute zum Geburtstag.
In southern England, the greatest armada of all time finally set sail, heading for Normandy. More than 6,000 vessels gathered in the middle of the channel. Except for the easily recognizable 4-engine bombers, all Allied aircraft were painted with white and black invasion stripes that could be seen from a great distance and thus avoid friendly fire from the ground. The landing would take place the next day. June 6th would become history.
C-47 Skytrain. This military version of the DC-3 was nicknamed Dakota by the British. It was used for parachuting, glider towing, troop transport, casualty evacuation, freight and postal delivery. With over 10,000 made, it is the most produced transport plane in history.
The night before the landings, the resistance carried out more than 1,000 sabotage operations to disrupt German communications and isolate Normandy. Meanwhile, in England, Allied airborne troops were embarking. Just after midnight, 6 gliders carrying 30 men each landed between the Canal and the Orne River bridges. They had been mined, and it was crucial to seize them intact. The forces arriving later from the beaches would use them to quickly reinforce the eastern flank. Taken by surprise, both bridges were captured and demined within a few minutes. An hour later, to the west, the arrival of 2 American airborne divisions was much tougher. The 13,000 American paratroopers were dropped from their C-47s over a huge area behind Utah Beach, many far from their targets around Saint-Mère-Église and Saint-Marie-du-Mont. The Germans had flooded much of the area behind the beaches, and dozens of paratroopers drowned on landing. Undetected by the Germans, the Armada, led by cruisers and battleships, dropped anchor about 20 kilometers from the coast, most of them out of range of German artillery batteries. Despite their famous crickets, which were intended to help paratroopers find each other at night, nearly half were missing. But Saint-Mère-Église was taken, and thus the Americans controlled the Cherbourg Road. The position had to be held until reinforcements could arrive from Utah Beach. Soldiers were transferred from troop ships to landing craft, each with 32 men. The Long-sur-Mer artillery battery was right in the middle of the Allied landing zone. At dawn, on June 6, the horizon was hidden by fog.
Oh mein Gott. Die Alliierten. Sie kommen.
While the landing craft approached the shore, Allied ships blasted the German coastal defenses. The firepower became apocalyptic when hundreds of bombers took over from the fleet. Flying along the coastline, medium-sized bombers dropped their bombs on Utah Beach fortifications, targeted strikes that destroyed most positions along the shore. At the same time, over Omaha Beach, heavy bombers attempted a frontal attack. Lack of visibility and fear of hitting their own landing craft delayed their bombing for a few seconds. So despite the bombing, the defenses of Omaha Beach remained intact. Strong currents pushed the first assault waves nearly 2 kilometers south, fortunately for them. Here, the German defenses were lighter. The follow-on convoys were directed to the same location. Many of the amphibious tanks leading the attack sank with their crew. Just behind, the first waves of infantry were sent into a 10-kilometer front without any protection. The battery at the top of Pointe du Hoc was still a threat to both Utah and Omaha beaches. After sustained bombing, 225 U.S. Rangers stormed the eastern flank of the cliff to neutralize those guns. The climb to the cliff top and the subsequent fighting were murderous. But 20 minutes after the start of the assault, the bunkers were captured. The brave Rangers discovered the feared cannons were not in the bunkers. Hidden a kilometer away, they would be found and destroyed. In the British sector, the tide had begun to rise. At last, the assault began.
June 6, 1944. Papa went to look on the beach and shouted, "English ships! The Allies are coming!" Shells whistled and burst over us. Our final hour had come. Suddenly the shots were further apart. We went outside and Papa wanted to check on Mrs. Dumont. He returned quickly. She has a wounded Englishman. We were to nurse him. He gave me 4 sweets, and I heard my first English words. Thank you.
Close to 25,000 British soldiers landed on a 5-kilometer front to the east of the planned site. Their mission was to capture Bayeux, but first to take the high ground overlooking Aramonge. With French soldiers from Kiefer's commando leading, 29,000 men landed at the set time. After crossing Pegasus Bridge, they were set up on both banks of the Orne River. Then, joining up with the Canadians of Juno Beach, they had to capture Caen before nightfall. In Juno's western sector, 7 amphibious tanks out of 29 sank. But the Canadians, determined to take their revenge for Dieppe, overcame fierce German resistance. Their mission? Join up with the British from Sword Beach and capture the Caen airfield. At the German headquarters, confusion reigned.
Jetzt rufe ich aber an. Hallo? Hallo, hallo, hallo!
They were awaiting Hitler's orders, yet the only order he had given was not to be awakened before 9 a.m. Still trapped between German crossfire and the rising tide, American troops were being decimated. Then, 8 destroyers charged toward the beach at flank speed from the sea. They came in close to fire on the deadly cannons. The shots were spot on. Taking advantage of this unexpected support, small groups broke through the German defense lines. Aiming for the Orne River bridges, heavy bombers dropped more than 150 tons of bombs on Caen.
We heard aircraft hovering above. Boom! We hid in the bathroom. I was facing my cousin, who smiled at me one last time as a second bomb fell on the house next door. Everything collapsed. Therese and I were buried under the rubble. We fell all the way through the cellar and we had 2 floors and the attic on top of us. Therese said nothing. She was next to me and her right arm was around my waist. I was begging to get me out of there as quickly as possible. And they brought me here, to the shelter.
Now, back in France, Rommel learned that Hitler had finally agreed to release some of the reserve armored divisions. The 21st Panzer Division launched a counterattack and reached the coast. But outnumbered and surrounded, it withdrew to the north of Caen. Saint-Mère-Église was now seized. The road to Cherbourg was in the hands of the U.S. Army, and around Saint-Marie-du-Mont, the bridgehead was firmly secured behind Utah Beach. Mission accomplished. Aramonge was liberated, and the British reached the outskirts of Bayeux, miraculously spared. Of all the Allied troops that landed at dawn, the Canadians pushed deepest into the countryside, but they were stopped north of Caen. The troops landed on the beach, succeeded in joining the airborne division. Near Pegasus Bridge, the Café Gondry became the first liberated house in France. The eastern flank was secured, but Caen remained out of reach. As soon as the battles were over on the beaches, reinforcements arrived without waiting for a real port to be seized. At Omaha, the bridgehead was very thin. Soldiers and civilians suffered heavy losses, but the landing was a success. By the evening of June 6th, the Allied forces had opened up a large breach in the Atlantic Wall.
June 6, 1944. It all seemed unreal. This section was under intense fire from the pillboxes we could see on the hill. Every fifth machine gun bullet is a tracer, glowing red. They're so dense and crisscrossed, you can't believe anyone can get through it alive. I wonder if I'll ever be able to forget all this.
The longest day was finally over, but in Normandy, the longest summer was just beginning.
Bulldozer, this humble workhorse neglected by history, played a vital role in the early hours of the landing, clearing obstacles and leveling the beaches. Later, it cleared roads, dug passages through hedges, plowed under the minefields, and, most importantly, created makeshift runways.
Now, the Allied forces had to fight Hitler's armies on their own ground. A major port was essential, but Cherbourg was not yet taken. And that's why the Allies brought 2 artificial ports over from England and began setting them up on June 7th, Mulberry A and Mulberry B, also known as Port Winston. The breakwaters were made of 6,000-ton concrete blocks built in England. These floating caissons were towed across the channel. Once in Normandy, their bottoms opened up to allow water in and they sank to the seabed. Having demarcated the calm water area, the floating piers were installed. The piers were built on a special sliding system that allowed them to float up and down with the tide. The harbor was large and deep enough to accommodate the biggest ships. Only 10 days after D-Day, each Mulberry was able to disembark thousands of equipped men, hundreds of vehicles, and up to 7,000 tons of supplies a day. Mulberry A was destroyed by a violent storm on June 19th. Desperate to reach their top priority objective, the Americans, led by General Collins, captured Fortress Cherbourg just 20 days after D-Day. The Cherbourg harbor, badly damaged by the Germans, was once again made functional by August, and for months it was the busiest port in the world. Fuel came via pipeline under the channel. The Germans tried to use the railway lines, but Allied aerial supremacy was total. Montgomery's main objective was finally captured on July 9th, after several attempts and with considerable British and Canadian losses.
Sunday, 23rd of July. Many French civilians have returned to what remains of their villages. It is very touching to see how they take care of the graves of our soldiers. It was often impossible to bury them in the cemetery during the heat of the battle. And the men are often buried where they fell.
When preparing Overlord, the Allied commanders had not taken into account the height and the thickness of the Normandy hedgerows. The Germans knew this terrain well and used the hedgerows to carry out ambushes and to set up stubborn defenses. The deadly Battle of the Hedgerows lasted until late July. On the 19th, Saint-Lô, or what was left of it, was liberated by the Americans. 95% destroyed, it had become a martyr city. After the American breakthrough on July 25th, Hitler ordered 4 armored divisions into a counterattack west toward Mortain in an attempt to split the American advance. The Tiger was the most powerful German tank and the most feared. But the Allied forces had become real tank killers. Germans had to fall back to the east, giving the Allies an opportunity to capture several German divisions in a trap, the Falaise Pocket. Spearheaded by Polish and Canadian divisions, the Allied pincers eventually snapped shut on August 19th. "40,000 Germans had surrendered by August 21st. 100 days after D-Day, the Battle of Normandy was finally over. The road to Paris was now open.
The Jeep. Today, we might argue about how the Jeep got its name, but everyone considers this four-wheel drive vehicle a symbol of the liberation of Europe. According to Eisenhower, the bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, the C-47 Skytrain, and the Jeep are the keys to victory.
The human cost of the Battle of Normandy was enormous. More than 200,000 Allied dead or wounded, and nearly 400,000 dead, wounded, or captured on the German side. The Norman civilian toll was also very heavy, up to 20,000 dead, mostly victims of the bombing of their cities. But the course of the Second World War had definitively shifted in favor of the Allies. On August 25th, General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division helped Parisian insurgents to liberate their city, and General de Gaulle, leader of a free France, could march triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. Throughout winter, the Allied forces fought on in severe conditions in Belgium and the Netherlands. It was not until May 1945 that they finally forced the Third Reich into an unconditional surrender. And on September 2nd, 1945, with Japan's surrender, 6 years exactly after its beginning, World War II finally ended. It resulted in over 60 million victims worldwide, military and civilian. Today, there still are wars, in one place or another, on our planet. But most of us live freely, in a relatively peaceful world. Well, the last witnesses of the Second World War are departing forever. Let us not forget what millions of men and women had to suffer in order to leave us a better world. Let us be grateful to those who gave everything, including their lives, for our liberty.